Hi, James.
Perfect. All right, well, I think since it's 6:31, we can start and people can pop in if they want. Great. So, hi, my name is Hannah Weinberger. I am a board member with the Northwest Science Writers Association. I want to start off by saying, for those of us in the Seattle area, my colleagues and I would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of the Coast Salish peoples, specifically the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, who are still here. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. The Coast Salish peoples have stewarded this land long before anyone else was here, learning things that enhance our understanding of what the Salish Sea area needs to sustain itself, and we're in their debt. I would also like to extend that gratitude to the traditional peoples and lands of our participants, which include the traditional lands of the Suk, Saanich, Songhees, Lummi, Samish, and Semiahmoo. I'd like to introduce Dr. Deborah Giles, a research biologist specializing in orcas for the University of Washington Center for Conservation Biology, and a resident scientist for the UW Friday Harbor Labs, and Dr. Rachel Bender Ignacio, medical director of the COVID-19 Clinical Research Center at Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center, and an assistant professor at the UW Department of Medicine's Division of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. Thank you, Drs. Giles and Bender Ignacio, for joining us as we discuss an important aspect of what it means to be a scientist.
Thank you for having me.
Throughout the conversation, we will be taking questions via the chat. Thanks to my colleague, James Gaines, for keeping an eye on that. So if you have anything that you want to share, please watch that. We'll also try to post some interesting reads about our panelists' work. Okay, so for many people who conduct research, professional credibility hinges upon perceived objectivity about their work. They can comment on the scientific value of discoveries and, in applied fields, develop recommendations. But historically, scientists refrained from explicitly wielding their expertise to champion policy decisions or movements or publicly refute bad actors. Increasingly, though, and especially after this past year and a half, more of us are looking to scientists for guidance on not only how the world works, but the ethics of engaging with it. And such, scientists are using their knowledge to not only educate the public, but also advocate for things like social and environmental justice movements. So, with that in mind, let's start with some brief background. Dr. Giles, how would you describe the work that you've been doing the past few years?
Well, I have at least 3 hats. I'm a professor. I teach at the University of Washington Friday Harbor Labs. I teach a marine mammals of the Salish Sea class, usually in the spring quarter. Since 2009, I've been a field biologist with the Center for Conservation Biology at the university main campus. And in that role, I have been the local lead for the whale scat project, where we use a scat detection dog on the front of the boat to sniff out killer whale feces non-invasively, which we then collect and send down to Dr. Wasser's lab at main campus to analyze for everything from pregnancy hormones, stress hormones, nutrition hormones, toxicants, and then a laundry list of other things. And then I am the science and research director at a nonprofit called Wild Orca, where we take that science, not only what we're putting out, but anything else that's coming out about the whales, and translate that in a way that's understandable to the public, and putting that science in the hands of the public and policymakers so that the best decisions can be made to recover this population of endangered whales.
Thank you so much. And James is dropping a link in the chat, I believe, that you can check out some more about that. And Dr. Bender Ignacio, what have you been working on?
Well, like many of those of us who do infectious disease, I made a big pivot this past year. So I am a physician scientist at the university and at the Fred Hutch. My primary focus has been on HIV and co-infections, predominantly viral co-infections and HIV-associated malignancies. I'm also the director of the University of Washington's AIDS Clinical Trials Unit, which is based at Harborview. And also engage in a lot of HIV work at the Hutch. Starting, at the beginning of March of last year, became, immediately and deeply engrossed in in epidemiology around COVID and COVID and the intersection of HIV. And then I've been conducting therapeutics clinical trials for COVID essentially since April of last year. I was asked to lead one of the first big NIH-funded studies for hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin. We all know how well that went, but then science has been moving really quickly. And so since August, I've been directing the Hutch's brand new standalone COVID clinical research center, through which we have had a number of both observational and interventional treatment trials. And then also through the AIDS clinical trials group, which is a big NIH-funded clinical trials network that normally focuses solely on HIV treatment. We've also been working through what was Operation Warp Speed and is now called the US government COVID-19 response to implement some of these really large clinical trials. And so my other hat through that is actually sitting on the international protocol team for one of the active trials called Rise Above COVID, or Active 2. It has 4 names because everything with COVID is complicated. But it's a big multi drug adaptive platform study to try to rapidly bring COVID treatments, and it's now enrolling in the US and actually more countries than I could count coming on board every day to try to rapidly study COVID treatments.
Great. Well, there's a lot of overlap within both of your fields when it comes to scientific expertise, application, and advocacy. And I'm hoping that we can start things off with some operational definition making. Dr. Bender Ignacio, what's the difference between offering scientific expertise related to something you study and advocacy? Where is that line?
For me, I'm not sure that there is necessarily a firm line. I mean, I think that especially when you take care of populations that are disproportionately burdened by infectious diseases, and we know that both HIV and COVID affect Brown and Black communities, immigrant communities, marginalized communities in every way, gender minorities and sexual minorities as well, especially for HIV. We really have to be advocates because it's really hard to sit back and sort of say, this is what I think is an appropriate scientific treatment if I don't think that, it's accessible or available to the populations that we're trying to improve the lives of. So I think that advocacy, is directly bound up in doing the research.
That's great. What about you, Dr. Giles? I think you're muted.
Thought I was going to learn that lesson in 2021. For me, I actually didn't go to college until I was quite old. I didn't start undergrad until I was 30. And I came through the university system at a time when the notion of being a conservation biologist was not crazy talk. And kind of the basic tenets of conservation biology is that, we are studying endangered species, usually endangered species. And so it's a crisis-oriented discipline by definition. And so that already puts us at a position where we don't have that luxury of just doing science for science sake. Not just doing it so that we know more about dive profiles or, even social interactions or something like that. But we're really everything that we do must be looked at within the lens of how that information can be used to help recover the population or some constituents, in the case of the Southern residents that I study the most, in the case of their imperiled and endangered prey. For me, in my mind, there was never a distinction between being a scientist and being a conservation biologist or an activist. I don't see that as being a dirty word or something to shy away from, where I think that folks that were going through the disciplines earlier, even 5 or 10 years before me, were schooled in a different way. And so that's one thing is that I have always felt very comfortable, and in fact, not just comfortable, but felt a responsibility to put the science in the hands of of the public and policymakers, make myself available to elected officials who are asking for the best available science. To just do the science and hope, cross one's fingers and hope that it gets in the right place has never been an option for me.
Right. So, it sounds like for Dr. Giles, at least, you entered a world where that line was already blurred. Dr. Bender Ignacio, has your relationship with the idea of advocacy or action around your subject matter expertise changed over the years?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that until maybe this last year, I was more comfortable with doing advocacy around HIV specifically. And then, found that there was a really big change at the beginning of last year, and decided to weigh in very publicly into something that is, within my wheelhouse as an epidemiologist, but not directly my area of expertise. Which was the intersection of racism and COVID, and police violence and racism. And, the way that happened essentially was I'm on a speakers group for the Infectious Disease Society of America. I'm one of the board members of the HIV Medicine Association. And so we were getting these continued, media requests through our media connections, asking to speak on certain topics. And I'd commented on the media, in the media about, do you need to wash your groceries, and things like that back in March of last year. And then I started seeing an increased number of requests for things that, around the George Floyd protests that were asking, should people shut down protests because of the risk of COVID? And, I sort of sat there for a moment and said to myself, like, I'm not an expert on racial justice. I'm a white woman. I'm acknowledging that I'm a white woman, but I am a white woman in a position of privilege and power as an academic. And, my colleagues have been saying very loudly for the last forever that, not racism is killing Black and brown people through COVID and through police violence. And I couldn't sit back and watch, sort of my colleagues getting interviewed for various news outlets across the country and kind of saying, guarded things, hemming and hawing about, well, the increased crowds could potentially this, that, and the other thing. And maybe we should make sure that there's no, protests. And I even saw a colleague quoted saying something like, well, it would be very different if they were sitting in the park quietly listening to Mozart and not shouting. And so, got together with a group of colleagues and wrote a statement about this, and gathered a group of other epidemiologists and infectious disease docs who were women of color who may or may not have had the safety to get to speak about this, and wrote this letter that at first was sort of somewhat anonymous, other than that I posted from my Twitter account. And got 1,200 people before it was published, and then ultimately about 4,000 people signing this letter that went public. Was in the New York Times and on CNN, stating that that as epidemiologists, we have to understand the intersection of how racism is killing Black and brown people through both COVID and police violence, and that if we shut down protests, we're actually anti-public health at that moment. And not only that, but that the burden on keeping these protests safe was on the police, who were doing the majority of the sort of COVID unsafe things, like tear gas causing people to cough, packing people into tight areas, arresting people, kenneling people and putting people in jail. And so, for me, that sort of was outside of my prior wheelhouse, but I felt like I had to really augment that message that I was hearing from my colleagues, and not only augment that message, but really change the narrative, which I think this letter really did, was to get my mainly, white colleagues who are epidemiologists to stop speaking to the media in ways that kind of continued to not pay attention to or even disregard the impact of racism on the pandemic. And so I think that was a really important thing to have done, especially again, because some of my colleagues who wanted to be involved with it, who helped write the letter, who made sure the message was coming from a place that felt like it was authentic for, from being, Black physicians, for example, were nervous speaking to the media because they're early career scientists or physicians at academic institutions, and didn't know if they felt comfortable or were just grieving, during that week after George Floyd's murder. And so that felt like an important way to sort of step in and make sure that we as scientists weren't contributing to harm.
Right. And we just came up on a really sobering anniversary. So George Floyd's murder just passed. But, this is a good opportunity to talk about, as you have both been increasingly vocal in some fairly, controversial issues. Have you ever experienced professional repercussions for the things that you've said publicly? What has that been like? While we're talking about racism and protests, Dr. Bender Ignacio, if you want to continue that.
Yeah, it was a pretty scary couple of weeks after doing that. And again, I say it was a scary couple of weeks, like as a white woman, right? So and I think part of what was scary was thinking about, if with as much harassment as I got, what was happening to my colleagues who helped write this letter, who again were predominantly Black women. I posted that letter on, we have a professional idea exchange. It's like a chat board within our members only website for the Infectious Disease Society of America. And I posted it and said, before it was published, said, if I know many of you agree with this, not everybody might, but consider signing on. And I got a lot of public comments, or not, I guess public to the society, but a closed society, saying that I was racist against white people, and people debating on this forum whether or not, we were intentionally racist against white people or unintentionally racist against white people. It was really amazing that sort of just went on unmoderated for a while. And I really actually worried about speaking up, as, again, I'm one of the board members of the HIVMA, and I sort of worried, was I supposed to leave politics out of that posting? Nobody really had been talking about politics. But I think over the last spring, it was increasingly hard to separate politics from COVID response. And yeah, and I got a bunch of people found, my private email and called myself and one of my other colleagues who are Jewish, a lot of terrible anti-Semitic stuff. We had a lot of nasty things written into that Google form that we had to sort of clean out as unverified signatures with, hateful things written in.
I'm so sorry.
I guess I have to say I was really lucky sort of during that week. It was uncertain as to how the university would feel about it. And I was really lucky that even, I think Anna Marie Cross, the president of the university, retweeted an article about us and about the effort. And I think the university really embraced it. But I was really worried more about the younger Black physicians that had spoken up with me, and would they, feel unsafe as sort of early career people at the university. And I think, we're really lucky at the University of Washington that was really well supported. And I don't think that used to be true.
Great. Dr. Giles has mentioned that she's in a field that's inherently embraced kind of the application advocacy component of the work.
Let me I actually made a note to correct that. I'm not saying that marine mammalogy or marine biology is like that. I'm saying I personally went through academia at a time when there was dialogue starting, and it had started in 1985 with Michael Soule forming the discipline of conservation biology. That it was as a student, I'm saying these concepts of being able to do research and then putting the research in the hands of policymakers was not foreign. Coming into the working world is another thing.
Right.
I have had I would say it's changing, but I've been a professional whale researcher since 2005. It's changing over that amount of time, that 16 years or so. But when I first started, I had colleagues kind of almost more warning me, I guess, like, oh, Giles, you've got to be careful. You can't be both a researcher and an advocate. Your science will be questioned. And my response to that is, I don't care if my science is questioned. I have, you can replicate my research. You can do it yourself. I'm very rigorous in the science that I have done on my own and that I participate in. But it was more out of a concern by colleagues about whether or not I would be taken seriously as a researcher. Again, that has changed. And I just feel so badly, that folks, what you're explaining that you've been through is just so far and away beyond anything that I've ever had to deal with. I have never felt my life was maybe at risk, for example. And so what you've had to deal with is it's a different ballgame completely. And I'm sorry that you and your colleagues are going through that, but it's your voices that are changing the dialogue. So thank you.
Right. We're shifting gears a little bit here, but with all of that in mind, like, have any, Dr. Giles, of your colleagues' early concerns about how you would be perceived as a researcher panned out?
No, I don't think so. And as a matter of fact, I hear them more and more speaking more along those lines of like, wow, we really need to come together and make sure that the research is being utilized. That being said, I have always enjoyed a very wide base of support amongst my colleagues. It's not just me. It hasn't just been me out there. There was kind of a older established concern about this mixing of scientists actually advocating and going and having meetings and things like that. That being said, there's always been some contingency of folks that are able and interested and willing to go above and beyond just doing the science. And with killer whale work, I'm studying, I'm one of a few people on the planet that are studying an extremely imperiled population of animals. There's only 75 of them left. And so I think the fire is underneath us to do something about it. We can't pretend that things aren't dire. And so, I do feel very lucky to have a group of, there's 5 of us that are regularly coming into contact and seeking out meetings with our elected officials in Washington State and at the federal level. And then there are a huge army of people from the public that are also engaging in a very, very proactive way. And so I'm sad to say that we have some step back from our current 2 elected officials and our governor against some pretty well-established and well-supported rationale for removing some dams. But I guarantee you some of my next calls are going to be to set up meetings with Governor Inslee and Maria Cantwell and Patty Murray to talk to them again about the need to do a variety of different actions, the Snake River Dam removals being one of them.
Great, right. So for people listening, Dr. Giles' work often centers on how to save orcas. And one of the components of that is, improving life for salmon, and salmon tend to have their lives imperiled by dams. How do you handle that, especially when there are so many people who depend on dammed rivers? So, Dr. Giles, what has it been like watching these conversations about dams get, more heated or more widespread? And how do you navigate, being a voice in those kind of conversations?
The more heated the conversations are, in some ways, the better, because it means that people are actually talking about it and thinking about it and coming closer to an opportunity where we can get to a table and have dialogue. So I feel pretty good about that. When I first got involved with this issue back in 2014, I had been studying the Southern residents since 2005 as a professional researcher. But I really only got involved with the Snake River Dam issue in 2014. we had no movement. We couldn't get a meeting with an elected official to save our lives back then. And that is very different now. Dr. Joe Gatos from the CDOC Society and I, among other people, went back to Washington, D.C. in October of 2019 and had 2 days full of meetings with our congressional offices. That's huge. We would not have been able to have that in 2014 or 15 or even 2018. And so I think that, COVID has set all of us back in so many ways. We're probably just starting to understand how many things got stymied, but there is a groundswell of people who are understanding the issue more and more every day. And I think an interest in both perspectives, keep the dams or remove the dams, are getting to the point where we're ready to, we're all kind of done, running around in our own circles and, gnashing our teeth and wondering what we're going to do. I think everybody's getting to that point where we need to just get to the table and start having direct dialogue with each other to come to some understanding about where we're going to go with this.
Great, thank you. And a reminder to everyone listening, if you have questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. For Dr. Bender Ignacio and for Dr. Giles, if you wanted to toss something in here about this, but I'm curious, with all of this in mind, it seems like more people in both of your fields are becoming vocal. You've either recruited them yourself or they have joined the table of their own volition. Not everyone has the same opinions. How do scientists keep each other in check when they utilize their science to promote certain views? Is that something where someone has a place, or like how do you handle that?
I feel like there's not very much controversy probably between scientists about HIV. I feel like, most of us at least are, work very closely. It's been a long history of working with the community, both people living with and affected by HIV. And so, I think there's been really powerful partnerships. It's not uncommon to go to our big scientific conferences and to be at an after party with Timothy Ray Brown, who was the first person cured of HIV, and to just go, talk to him and, listen to his story and thank him for, really just informing what we do. And I think most people are sort of in that place of having really close, involvement in the community. So I don't think that there's I haven't really had any sort of like scuttlebutts, I think, with other HIV scientists. I think with COVID, there certainly has been a big, sort of divide in different theories about things. A lot of it has come between people who are experts in the field and people who are just entering because it's a pandemic and everybody's jumping in on it, in the news or in social media. And there've been a lot of theories that have been wrong. I mean, I actually was just looking at it, something that I said that said COVID wasn't airborne, it was more than a year ago at this point. But I think that we've all, been learning a lot very quickly. And yeah, there's been a lot of sort of uncomfortable conversations between scientists arguing about, the best way to both advance the science and how to apply that. I think the biggest concerns have been, about policy and just, for example, just this last week with the mask guidance that came out from the CDC, there's a lot of argument between scientists and between policymakers about, is the science is correct, but then how does that science inform policy? And was the message about the correct science transmitted in a way that will inform policy correctly? And I think there's been a lot of heat about that. I think I mainly try to stay out of that really controversial kind of, those controversial conversations so much.
Absolutely. And Dr. Giles, there are definitely some parallels in the work that you do.
I think for me, it comes down to bandwidth to some degree. I'm very lucky to have, number one, to be working with the University of Washington Center for Conservation Biology. as was mentioned earlier, the university has been very supportive of those of us that are taking our science and really making sure that it's getting out there. They're fantastic at I'm sorry, I don't have the words for social media, but when a story comes out and then they broadcast it on the within the university and widely, they have been fantastic about covering the southern resident killer whales and anything that our science is saying, and even meetings and such that we've had with elected officials. So the university is I feel very supported by being a conservation biologist, and a vocal one at that. And similarly, my nonprofit Wild Orca, we have fantastic researchers and staff writers that are constantly making sure that they have the most available science. They're translating that science that's coming out in a way that is understandable and palatable to the general public, and then taking that information and creating calls to action so that the public can get involved and know how to get involved in the most I think, what do I want to say, dynamic, but also very direct way. We're teaching people how to make phone calls to the elected officials, not just saying, call your elected official, but we're teaching them how to make that call. What's the phone number? What are kind of some of the things that you might want to say to convey the information? How do you do a follow-up? Things like that are, I feel very proud to be doing that kind of work as well. So I think that for me, the best thing that can continue to happen is that dialogues stay open, that we don't get so entrenched in our sides that we are incapable of having continuing dialogue, especially when it comes down to something as imperiled as this population of animals. We need to be able to pivot quickly and take the kind of be an adaptive, iterative process with regard to what's happening with these whales and the ecosystems, because they're not just Washington's whales, even though we like to claim them. They do go all the way down to California. We need to be able to be dynamic and add that information in, and constantly be bringing the newest information to the public. So I think for me, it's an incredibly rewarding opportunity to be able to do the science and then have it be recognized at a management level or at a policy level. And it's pretty much a conservation biologist's dream. That's what we seek when we get our degrees, is to do science and then see it be put into action.
Great. And so it sounds like professionally there's support behind what both of you are doing, but you both work within ecosystems of scientists or physicians or researchers. Have you noticed this increasing participation of scientists in policy and advocacy issues changing the way that you do your work? Dr. Bender Ignacio, if you want to start that one.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, one of the big things with COVID clinical trials is, as we are talking about the disproportionate burden of COVID on Black and Brown communities in the US, we're really sort of, I keep using the hashtag, we're not done yet, because we keep talking about, well, there's vaccines and there's COVID treatments. So why are we still doing COVID research? And I think I keep, giving this answer. And I think a lot of my colleagues are finally coming around to thinking about intertwining with, community outreach and access more so than ever in clinical trials. And just as a community, we've really had to think about this, about, the fact that we have effective vaccines, and there are a couple effective treatments. Another one got an emergency use authorization by the FDA yesterday, but they're all infused monoclonal antibodies, which means that they're expensive and take a lot of resources, and they're hard to get. And so I think, we've been really sort of working amongst a crowd of people who said, we're not done doing this research until we have something that everybody can get at their home from their primary care doctor, not just in the US, but globally. This has to be something that's portable to India, to sub-Saharan Africa. And I really think that there has really been sort of a sea change around this in demanding that, and and demanding that the vaccines that have come out of this research that have been predominantly, developed through government funds, but then monetized and produced through pharmaceutical companies, to really be publicly speaking about sort of anti-vaccine nationalism, right? And saying that these vaccines were meant for everybody, and that we're not out of this pandemic until everyone is safe. We're not safe until everyone is safe. And I think that has been, I think there's been a lot more activism around those types of things in this past year. And I've been really thrilled to sort of be part of that community that's demanding that, that treatments and vaccines are really there for everybody, and our work isn't done until they are.
Great. This is a good opportunity to bring in a listener question about Mary White wants to know more about your work with communities. So, the research that you're doing, the application recommendations that you're making affect people. How has your relationship with people changed outside of your work environments, because of your advocacy? Dr. Giles, if you want to take that one.
I am very happy to see so much more interest in and seeking out of the Coast Salish deep knowledge, the historical knowledge of this area, and of the whales themselves. So having an opportunity to work with and consult with and rely on that tribal understanding of this ecosystem, this place, and the whales that rely on this space, and then of course the fish that both the whales and the humans would have historically relied on, has been just the most gratifying part, one of the most gratifying things that I've ever gotten to experience. There is an absolute groundswell of interest from what I'll call non-tribal people in making sure that the tribe voice is heard. And I would like to see that more and more. The tribes have so much to say about what's happening with these whales and this ecosystem, because ultimately, if we recover these whales, it means that we've done something great, really great, which will ultimately benefit every part of the ecosystem, and including, and probably most importantly, the tribes that have been here for since time immemorial, as the saying goes. These are folks that would have relied on the marine realm for the bulk of their protein. And I worry about that right now, because they're suffering from a lot of the same things that the whales are suffering from. And these are tribes that are becoming very engaged and vocal about what's happening with these whales. And again, the whales can be seen as really as an icon for the health of this ecosystem. We look out here and it looks beautiful. The Salish Sea looks beautiful. But when you really start digging down and looking at the science, looking at the constituent parts of what's happening out here, it's very clear that it's not healthy. It's not healthy for the whales, and it's not healthy for the humans who live here, especially those that are rooted here in a deep way. Right. And so that makes me feel really, really fortunate to be plugging in more and more to that community of people.
What are the challenges of doing that, of engaging more in the community?
In the tribal community?
Yeah.
I don't see any negatives or problems with it. It's just a matter of making those connections, meeting the people. That's the stumbling block so far, is just not necessarily yet having an opportunity where we have a round table of, or I would say more like a tent or a space for all of us to come together. But the plight of these whales, the whales themselves are telling about their plight, and more people are connecting because of that. And so if we rely on the whales, I think of the whales as being better versions of ourselves. As humans, they care for one another, they nurse their young, they nurse their aging and their sick, They're very socially bonded, and they take care of each other. They forage and, collectively forage and share food, even when they're starving. And these are things that we humans across nationalities, across cultures, we can learn quite a bit from.
Great. And Dr. Bender Ignacio, I want to talk to you about, COVID treatment trials in a second, but, Dr. Giles, is there any difference in how you relate to people in communities that rely on some of the dams that people want to remove?
Yeah, I was very fortunate to be asked by the governor to sit on the killer whale task force, both for the prey work group and the vessel work group. And through those two opportunities, over the course of almost 2 years, I met so many people. One of the best things that came out of that killer whale recovery task force was the opportunity for people from different industries or interests coming together and meeting each other. I literally have in my phone numbers of people that I never would have had contact with. And I feel very comfortable calling them and reaching out and asking a question or offering info. That is fantastic. We also, out of that came a special 3-part series right at the end of right before COVID shutdown. So in January of 2020, we were going across the state to 3 different meetings and having an opportunity to actually meet with people who have had generations of people utilizing the water from the river that are irrigating the fields, that maybe it's a great grandson or great grandson of somebody who established a farm there, sitting right next to a tribal member, say a Palouse tribal member whose family had been living and fishing that river really since time immemorial, 14,000 years. And for those dialogues to start happening, that's what I was saying at the beginning, is having these opportunities to really come together in a way where it's clear. It is clear to everybody who wants to see that we are having a massive extinction in the fisheries realm. And so for us humans, to come together and start having really direct and open and honest conversations with each other about what on earth we're going to do to undo some of this damage. We are so much farther along, and in a lot of ways I attribute that to the governor's task force.
Right. And Dr. Bender Ignacio, you also experience in your research, a drive to incorporate and recognize the needs of a lot of varied communities, both as, a treatment researcher and someone who's been advocating for racial justice in medicine and beyond this year. Can you talk a little bit about what it's been like to get more, embedded within communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges with COVID is that all of the research is moving very quickly, sometimes in a way that the research trips over itself. And, nothing about working with communities should be quick. If it's relational, and I don't necessarily have, the people who are affected by COVID, it's not necessarily the same, communities that is in our community advisory board, our CAB for HIV treatment. And so I think one of the big challenges has been finding people who have those long-term relationships. So for example, at the Hutch, there's a really strong relationship between some of the Native communities about cancer prevention and cancer survivorship. For example, in Eastern Washington and the Navajo Nation, for example, also in partnership with New Mexico State University. There are a lot of people who work in the Latinx community and with Black communities around, in Seattle, and I don't personally have those relationships. And so, it's really been sort of finding and leveraging my colleagues who do, because that relational work is so, it's long founded, it comes through trust, it's important. It's not something that you can just barrel in and say, we want to do this treatment trial, are you guys in, right? And we need to have people tell us their concerns, their thoughts. And so sort of being able to move as quickly as we've been moving, where sometimes, one of the protocols, I guess I'd say, to back up, the average protocol for research for a study in humans takes at least a year from the first, sort of writing of the sort of initial outline of the protocol to when the first version is approved. And we went with one of our treatment trials from, 6 weeks from just the letter of intent to actually enrolling the first participant. So it's like really unprecedented. And so, it has been, I think, really challenging trying to sort of say, we need to listen to communities. We need to make sure this research is appropriate for people, but we also need to move fast. And we also need to, to be listening and to move fast. And I think that's really been challenging, but I've met a lot of really cool people, and I've met a lot of really great people who have these relationships and kind of have been able to incorporate our work through those relationships. And I think that's been really gratifying as well.
Right. So there's a lot of in both of your work, elevating other people's voices in order to drive conversations forward, both within your field of expertise and elsewhere. We have another listener question about another group of people who are involved in these conversations, your students. So do either of you have conversations with, lower rank researchers or students about what it means to be an activist as a scientist? And can you describe those conversations? Whoever wants to take that one.
Would you like to start, or shall I?
Go for it.
I love this question because I'm teaching right now at the university. I'm just finishing up. I'm going to miss these guys. I just, my students are just wonderful. And I always start my classes off with the open access, anybody can get it, an article that was written in 1985 by Michael Soule called "What is Conservation Biology?" And I root absolutely everything I do in my classes to that paper. It's an amazing, it was monumental and really very shunned by the science community when it first came out. But it goes back to these kind of deep ecology thoughts of the late 70s and early 80s about how we really do have this responsibility to recover the natural world and to give nature space. And so I start my classes with that paper. And then last year I was absolutely shocked. So because of COVID, my spring class got bumped to the autumn. And during the autumn quarter, this phenomenal paper came out. It's titled "From Science Only to Science for Conservation, A Personal Journey." And it's written by a whale researcher called Bernard Wursig. And I was just floored when this came out, because even a year ago or 2 years ago, I never would have expected to see this paper come out. And it came out right at a time when I was teaching students about this very concept. And if you have an opportunity, this also is open access. Again, it's Wursig is the last name. And he talks about, starting out as a young researcher in the 70s and how philosophies and the concept of this, a scientist using their voice to really highlight and spotlight their research it was unheard of back then. And he's making a really good case for the fact that we do not have time, especially for anything in the marine realm. We have no time to waste as far as just doing science, like I was saying before, for science sake. And so that's what I do. I mean, I live it and I breathe it, and I talk to my students about it. They see me in action. I have speakers come in that maybe don't hold that philosophy necessarily, and we have good dialogue. And I have had some, my students have gone on to do amazing things, not necessarily just because of my class, of course, but I think it resonates really deeply with younger people. And actually this article says it, that the younger people are so much more open to this way of thinking. It almost doesn't seem like it's a no-brainer. But I make a point of pointing out how far we've come as a community of scientists to be able to feel confident that we won't be shunned by our peers and blacklisted by our peers.
Great. Is that something that you have also seen in your interactions with students, Dr. Bender Ignacio?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think specifically for HIV, one of the main reasons why people are interested in joining that field and doing research with us is because they belong to one of the communities that are affected by HIV. So, a lot of people come in because they identify as queer, or they come from a community where there's a high prevalence of another community with a high prevalence of HIV, and I think just they come in as activists and then learn the science, and I really like to foster that. And I think it's really important. I have a medical student who's been working with me as a sort of in a scholar program over the last several years as part of medical school. And when I've had the chance to meet with our Washington State congressional leadership as well, brought him in to sit in on those meetings and get to talk to our congressional offices as well, and community advisory board meetings, et cetera, because I think it's really important. Because yeah, as Deborah said, the students are coming in as activists, and then sort of learning the science.
Great. And then here's a really good question. So we are a association here at the Northwest Science Writers Association of writers. A lot of us are journalists and science writers. Is there anything that journalists or science writers frequently get wrong or could do better when covering your areas of science, particularly when it relates to issues that can be considered controversial? If anyone wants to take that. Dr. Giles?
I think that one thing that could be done a little bit better is just by kind of maybe offering an opportunity, and you could ask for the guidance of the person that you're interviewing, is what are the next steps? So instead of just reporting on an issue, actually provide some, and I can see why that would be a hard thing as a journalist, because you're supposed to be reporting on both sides, but maybe that's what you do, is offering some opportunity for, because I'm sorry, I'm not articulating myself very well.
No, you're great.
People are hungry for wanting to know what they can do. What can I do? And sometimes the article is the only avenue that a person of the general public might have to an issue. So if there's some way to and this is, maybe just pointing to NGOs or something, because I recognize that, you or Crosscut, for example, who I've worked with extensively, they can't be like, go to Wild Orca and sign a petition. But we need people to have those tools. People or maybe this is it, just leaving your reader with a sense of empowerment, that every single individual has a role to affect change. And you can leave it broad like that. But I think that that's one of the things that individuals have. We are not taught that in this country, to really feel like we can affect change, but we can. And maybe that's just reading the article and then passing that article on to a friend or family member. Maybe that's as far as it goes, but maybe it's the next step to just let your reader know that they are part of they're part of the solution.
Great. Oh, what about you, Dr. Bender Ignacio? I just muted myself.
No, I think what Dr. Giles said about kind of reporting on both sides, I would actually say, I think it's important to know when not to report on both sides, right? I mean, I think was Bill Nye did that famous thing on climate change where he put like all of the scientists on one side and then said like, there's nobody on the other side of this room, right? When you actually ask scientists. And I sometimes feel like when if there is a true scientific controversy where scientists are actually saying things, quote, on both sides, then that's appropriate to report on the scientific controversy. But if it's a political controversy about science, I think it's really important as a science writer to not report on both sides, right? I mean, and to distinguish what's a politics on both sides versus science that doesn't have a clear consensus. I think that we've seen that a lot in the news about, sort of hot button stuff about
especially contributing to things that stoke fear, or, reporting on rare vaccine side effects, when what I think, we need to understand is, yes, people have the right to know about things like that. But I think that it's also really important to think about what is the best message to, what's the best message to give. The best message is to try to encourage confidence in vaccines. And it's not to obfuscate, if there are real side effects out there or real issues of concern. It's to not report on them as clickbait, right? And to make sure that we're thinking about what keeps people safe, what is the scientific message, what do scientists all agree on, and then trying to, I don't know, I guess take some of the political drama out of it when it is something that, like, everything that's happened in the last year.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying is absolutely spot on. I could not agree with you more. I think what I was trying to say is, for example, with a situation like the southern resident killer whales, where you have very distinct special interest groups who have, so for example, the irrigators on the east side of Washington State, and then the southern resident killer whales on the western side, where people are saying remove the dams. So it's a matter of, like, making sure that people can have access to the science, because unfortunately we get pitted. It's the east side against the west side, the whales against the farmers, and it shouldn't be that way. The science needs to be put in the hands of the public, and then the public empowered to learn more and get involved. So it's a ever so slightly difference of situation. But yeah, the science is the science. That's not to say that we don't have scientists, salmon scientists, and I'm just being a jerk by going salmon scientists. We have professionals saying that removing the dams is not going to do anything to recover wild Chinook salmon. So if Bill Nye was a salmon biologist, he'd pan over to that side of the room, and there'd be a couple of people over there saying, yeah, removing the dams isn't going to benefit wild Chinook salmon. But then if he panned over here, this room would be full over here. So I'm trying to mix my metaphors here, but do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's very similar in journalism too. There's been a zeitgeist shift from fair and balanced in many newsrooms to fair and researched, where providing the context and the information and letting it serve as, a standalone that can prove itself is the most important thing. So it sounds like that's what's happening in both of your fields as well. You can be a person so long as you interrogate your own biases and show your work.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And Dr. Jazz, I was definitely not trying to imply that you were, like, in favor of reporting both sides, but just bringing up that where science has a consensus versus the sort of non-science, different perspectives, and
yeah, absolutely.
Great. Thank you both so much. We have about a minute left. So if there's anything that you want to add, either of you, both of you obviously have time if you want, but if there's anything that this conversation has raised that you would want to leave people with about the ethical practices of navigating, life as a scientist advocate or as a communicator speaking with them, I'm sure people would love some pearls of wisdom.
For me, if you're a student, academic student, or just a student of life, my advice would be to always question beyond what the information that you're being given. If you're of a curious mind, seek out more information on your own, and most importantly, get involved, be educated, vote and vote and vote and vote. And be more educated, and then educate more people, and then vote.
Thank you so much. Dr. Bender Ignacio, is there anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I like to, I guess when I communicate with science writers, I like to provide the original references to what I say. You know, sometimes it takes a while, and I appreciate that. I think a lot of people that, you know, that I do interviews with don't want to take up a lot of our time, but I love when somebody says, well, where can I read? What are the references that I should be reading? Where is that good science? You know, I'm hearing this, actually something from PolitiFact. Somebody just, you know, got in touch with me to ask about, you know, a myth. Where's this myth from? And so, you know, rather than explaining this or is this true or real, I just, you know, said, here's these are the resources that I trust. And I think that that's a really great skill. It's a time investment, of course, but to just, you know, maybe use your scientist contacts to the media to be able to say, you know, what are you reading right now? What do you trust? Where is the science leading you? And then report on that. And I think that, you know, that's where the I don't know if there's a correct story, but, you know, the well-researched story comes from.
Great. Thank you both so much for being willing to have this conversation and for answering some listener questions. We really appreciate you both being here and the work that you do. This conversation was recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel soon. And we definitely encourage you to consider joining our organization and to continue reading about the work that Dr. Bender Ignacio and Dr. Giles do. So thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great.
Thank you.